Seeking to rediscover the U.S. after several years of living in China, the Fallows spent 5 years flying 100,000 miles across the heartland, stopping to investigate almost 50 small towns. They had culled the list from their own research and the nearly 1,000 responses that they got from a request James sent to his readers asking why their town deserved a visit. For the next few years, the Fallows spent a few days or a few weeks in towns as diverse as Greenville, South Carolina, to Duluth, Minnesota, from San Bernardino, California, to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Today, we're going to find out what they learned. So let's welcome Deborah Fallows, who is a linguist and a writer. She holds a PhD in theoretical linguistics and is the author of 2 previous books. She has written for The Atlantic, National Geographic, Slate, the New York Times, and the Washington Monthly, and has worked at the Pew Research Center, Oxygen Media, and Georgetown University. And we're also going to welcome her husband, James Fallows, who has been a national correspondent for The Atlantic for more than 35 years, reporting from China, Japan, Southeast Asia, Europe, and across the United States. He's the author of 11 previous books. His works have also appeared in many other magazines and as a public radio commentary since the 1980s. He's won a National Book Award and a National Magazine Award. And for 2 years, he was President Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter, one of his first jobs out of college.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you, David. Thank you all for coming here. Thanks for everybody who's made this possible. I am the Jim of the Jim and Deb duo, and I give you... Well,
Deb, I'm Deb. Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you all. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everyone, for having us here. This is my first time in Bellingham. Jim's been here a couple times before, and I couldn't be more thrilled. And this is true about the air, I'm afraid. But but we lived in China for nearly 4 years, so this doesn't faze us a bit. And we can imagine our way through it easily.
So you've already had an introduction to the tag team approach that we're going to take for the next while in setting out what we've seen around the country, what we've learned in the last now 4+ months of being on the road and going to communities like Bellingham and talking with people. I know there's nothing like Bellingham exactly, but communities of similar size and similar economic and other circumstance. So we've learned a lot, both about places we've been and sort of the connections between local news and the national predicament too, which will build up to some of that at the end. We deliberately, in our travels over the last 5 years, have never asked people about national politics or really volunteered views about that. If you want to ask us things about that at the question time, you can, but we're mainly going to talk about the bottom level up phenomenon we've seen in the United States. So what we'll do is I'm going to do a little bit of setup first about the project as a whole and how it started and the main couple of things that surprised us. Then Deb's going to tell us about one of the most surprising phenomena. We'll go back and forth in that sequence for a while, and I will give you the so-called big finish at the end of what, if the argument we're making is true, what it means for the U.S., what it means for cities like yours. If it's not true, what other paths there might be ahead. So that is the plan. And one thing I should ask is, I will assume that all of you possess our book, because that, of course, is a mark of the informed citizen, who we know is in Bellingham. But I will assume most of you have not actually read it yet. With that, so good. So okay. So people who have read this apart from Jane. So we have an informed super minority, a super informed minority of the group. But others of you, we can tell you a little bit. We'll fill in a little bit of the background too, and so then that is useful to know. So the background here is that Deb and I have been together for a long, long time. I've known Deb There's only one person in this audience I've known for more years than I have known Deb, and that is Margaret Kastner, my high school classmate from Redlands, California, who is over here. So I'm glad to see Margaret. But I met Deb about a year after I last saw Margaret at high school graduation, and we've been together since a blind date at age 18. We got married at age 21, and have been together on the road for the Atlantic all the years in between then. We had our honeymoon at the most glamorous of honeymoon sites, a labor camp in Ghana. And that's a whole separate story you can ask about.
That was a mistake.
And we raised our children in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and in Japan, and we've lived for many years in China, et cetera. But we've always been interested, wherever we've gone, in just going out and seeing things. When we were living in China, we went to almost every province except Tibet, which I could never get a journalist visa to, and Ningxia, I think we didn't go to, but every place else we went. We came back to the US at the end of a couple of China stints in 2011, back to DC, where we had been as our base for most of the last 40 years, and got pretty soon into the normal DC miasma of just, yeah, this is something, it's a world I know about, but I know too much about, and it's more interesting to see things elsewhere. So we began thinking of the next project we would do, and to sort of telescope the description. By early 2013, based on years we'd spent before flying around the country in our little propeller airplane, side note, how many pilots here? Yay, this is a good representation of the Pacific Northwest. How many pilot aspirants? Everybody should be a pilot aspirant. So the first times I came to Bellingham is when I was doing instrument training at Boeing Field. And we were living in Seattle 20 years ago, and I'd come up here for practice approaches in Bellingham and would come see the beautiful city. But we thought, we knew from this means of transport how varied and populated and diverse the interior of the country was. And in a way that I'll make a media point about. Many of you, I'm sure, recall the famous Saul Steinberg New Yorker cover from 20 or 30 years ago of the world as seen from Fifth Avenue or the East Side, where Fifth Avenue is distinct and Seventh Avenue, and then it's all kind of a blur, and then you get Hollywood, and then someplace out there is Japan. And we knew from traveling around and from being small towns ourselves, Redlands for me, Vermilion, Ohio for Deb, we knew how actually interesting and diverse was the nature of interior American life. And we knew that in the media, what was usually presented was any place other than DC, New York, Seattle, Miami, Los Angeles was presented, number one, when there was a disaster. A shooting, a forest fire, a drought, etc. Number two, when the Iowa caucuses were happening. So the reporter would go to every diner in Iowa and talk to people about who they liked. Or number three, when there was a concept story. Let's go ask Trump voters if they still like Trump. So you go to a diner and find somebody with a hat on, say, do you still like the person you voted for? And so that or other concept stories. And we thought, what if we tried to look at smaller town America as if it were independently interesting, not just as the backdrop for political primaries or shootings or concept stories, but just what was the story of Sioux Falls? What's the story of Bellingham? So a little more than 5 years ago, I put a post, as Jane said, on the Atlantic site saying, tell us the story of your town, a smaller town, a town that's had some kind of problem, one of economic, environmental, you name it, and a town whose response is interesting or significant in some way. And we got about 1,000 essays in response to that, including some about Bellingham. And from 49 of the 50 states, I'll leave that hanging for somebody to ask later on, we got responses of, here's why Moline, Illinois is the American city. Here's why Butte is the American city. Here's why Marshall, Texas is the place you want to go. So we started traveling, and without really knowing what was going to happen, we started in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and then Holland, Michigan 5 years ago, and just kept going. And we got to a geographically very wide extent of cities. as far northeast as Eastport, Maine. Anybody ever been there? It's a little tiny, wow, this is a surprising representation. I'll ask you later why you went there. It's a beautiful place. As far southwest as Ajo, Arizona, also San Bernardino in Southern California. We were in Central Oregon for a while here, in Montana. We were in the Deep South a lot, in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. Bigger cities like Columbus, Ohio, very tall, small places like Eastport, and a range in between. And began writing Atlantic Web posts, doing marketplace radio broadcasts, doing videos, and eventually thinking there was a book with a story to tell, because the main, I'll give you a more fine-grained interpretation of what we saw and was surprising, but the biggest surprise was, you all recall the famous Gertrude Stein line about Oakland, that there was no there there. In fact, what we found is there was a there there. Almost every place we went. Not every place, but almost every place, there was a sense of engagement and agency and people feeling as if they were not just bit players in some large saga of disaffection and dismay, but in fact they're playing some part in reinventing their institutions. Their downtowns, their environmental setup, their schools, their libraries, as we'll hear about in just a moment. So the sort of threshold argument we wanted to make in our book, and the reason to do a book, is to say that at a time of real national level polarization and dysfunction and unhappiness and everybody feeling as if the national level political system is not doing what they would like, people in a surprisingly wide range of towns, in a surprisingly wide range of economic circumstances. You know, San Bernardino is really in hard times, Erie, Pennsylvania is too, or Charleston, West Virginia. They felt as if they were moving forward rather than backward. And so that was the main pitch. We traveled for a long time. It wasn't scientific, but we felt it was representative of different parts of the country. We had this sense of excitement, engagement, and a real freshness and multidimensionality to it, and that's a story that we wanted to tell. So Deb is now going to tell you about one particular aspect of reinvention and surprise we found involving the world of education. And you need to hold that as well.
Okay. Thank you. It's like a clicker. Okay. Yes, sir. When we first arrived in the towns after committing to a certain place, we'd usually go through the same routine. On the first day, we would go out together and see the mayor if we could, somebody in the Chamber of Commerce, maybe somebody related to schools, the superintendent, or I would always drop into the library. We'd go by the newspaper office and kind of pay a call. We were just trying to get a sense of what stories we should hear about and follow, and who were the players in town, what people we should go see. And usually what happened was that the ideas we had when we arrived there of what would be interesting never quite worked out, and we'd go in completely different directions after talking to a few people. So that was the first day. And on days after that, Jim and I would usually split up. He would talk to the people about the town development or the politics, the economics, the business development, and I'd usually go to the schools or the libraries or other public institutions. We'd meet up at a brew pub at the end of the day and talk about the day and kind of take it from there. One of the first questions we asked on the first day is there an interesting school in this town we should go visit? And there always was. So Greenville, South Carolina was the first place where I became just completely overwhelmed by the schools, because we could have spent easily 2 or 3 weeks going to a different school every day in Greenville. I had to choose one, and so on the recommendation of a number of people, I chose a school called the A.J. Wittenberg Elementary School of Engineering. I mean, you've got to love it. So the way this school came about, Greenville is a former textile town, as you know, Greenville, South Carolina. And when the textile mills went away, there was a lot of big tech industry that moved in, BMW, GM, Michelin, a lot of other kinds of technological factories in one degree or another. So interestingly, the public institution of the school board got together at the urging of these tech companies who said, look, we are really interested in developing your student population, our student population here to be good workers. What we'd like to do is help you build some STEM schools. So the engineers in these companies got together with the school board and they helped design curriculum for STEM schools. And their showcase school was in a very distressed part of town where there actually wasn't even an elementary school before. They named it after an old school superintendent, the A.J. Wittenberg Elementary School of Engineering. What happened in that school was phenomenal. From pre-K through grades 4, you get these little bitty kids learning baby engineering, largely with the volunteer backbone of the engineers and other workers at these 3 companies. And it was perfect because the volunteers were about the age of these little kids' parents. And so there was a whole lot going on. And I went, they were called the Wittenberg Robots was, the name of every school team. And they ended up sending the first elementary school robotics team to Germany, which you can imagine this was, these are kids from who, the first time they've ever been on a plane, for one thing. And the whole town would get into this kind of cooperation, and they'd have, the year that we were there, they were learning about the physics of flight. And there was also the Peace Performing Arts Center that was about a 10-minute walk from the school down the Swamp Rabbit Trail that always did Broadway productions every year. And they happened to have a lot of ones like Peter Pan or other things that had flying people in them. And so the kindergartners would learn these stories about the physics of flight, and they'd make little books, and then they'd march them over to the Peace Center to go backstage to see how you actually constructed Peter Pan to get up into the air, and they'd see the production. So it was this complete community involvement. Greenville ended up building middle schools of STEM, but actually STEAM, and introducing the arts so the kids would have the social skills of learning how to cooperate, collaborate, collude, speak, write, negotiate, and build things together as teams. And they went on to the high school. So it has been interesting as a lesson because in that town with those elementary schools, it was a combination of what are our assets in this town, what are our needs, and how will this make the whole town better? And it was a win-win-win for the companies who could count on having these kids, for the school system and the kids who were trained for the kinds of jobs there, and for the whole of Greenville itself. At the high school level, we were there are so many examples, but we were in Winters, California, which is about 60 miles east of San Francisco in the agricultural region, a lot of stone fruit and a lot of nuts in the town. Winters, a lot of nuts. Nice nuts. The high school, you threw me off there. I didn't mean that, In Winters, in the high school, it's a town of about 10,000 people. Half the kids in the school take agriculture classes. It's relevant to them, and it's a really smart thing to do because they teach them about the history and economics of agriculture in California. They teach them about the use and maintenance of all the farm equipment. They teach them about the economics of farming and how to build a business, how to help sustain your family business in the farms, and about the new highfalutin technology of how agriculture works these days. So it's another example of this win-win for the tiny town. It's a way to be relevant to this youthful population so they can engage and learn about what their parents do on these farms and how they can be excited about taking over the family farms in a really knowledgeable way, and for the town to have this consistent population of kids who are going to stay there and help build the town. So agriculture in in winters was a way that they saw applying the assets of their town to their school system, and that has been a big success. A third example is the community colleges that we saw in Mississippi. We went to an area called the Golden Triangle of Mississippi, which is Columbus, Mississippi, Starkville, and West Point. Columbus itself was a former town. They had a few small industries. They had a blue jeans factory, they had a gravestone making factory, and they had a toilet seat production factory, all of which went away. People lost their jobs. In nearby Starkville, there was a Sara Lee company. That's pretty much gone too. So a long backstory of this son of a sheriff from Arkansas who's, your ears would burn when you hear this guy talk because he was used so much profanity. But Joe Max Higgins, an amazing guy with his business partner, Brenda Lathan, an African-American woman from the area, managed to attract $5 billion in new heavy industry to the Golden Triangle. There's a helicopter factory, a truck engine factory, a fancy new steel mill, and something else. I'm forgetting.
Military drones.
Military drones. They are working in collaboration now with the East Mississippi Community College, where they have kind of mini shop floors from these factories that are training their students who either are young, up-and-coming, post-high school grade students, or people who've lost their jobs in factories, how to be able to work precisely and technologically and reliably in these new factories. So it's tremendous job opportunities for this area of the Golden Triangle of Mississippi at starting wages of like $70,000 to $80,000 a year. So the creativity and the experimentation and the knowing your locale and your place to see how these different kinds of schools in all of these areas have evolved was one of the most surprising and truly optimistic pieces that we found. Clicker.
Thank you. I'm here to provide brief filler. You can think of me as a tiny little layer in a multi-tier McRib or something, or a quarter pounder before Deb's next segment. So I'm going to tell you a couple of other things we found, and Deb's going to tell you some more stories. So our book is arranged deliberately as stories rather than point-by-point outline, but let me give you just 2 or 3 outline points. I'll give you Deb for a couple more stories. Some of the things that were surprising to us that we've learned over the last 5 years that we've tried to convey to audiences around the country. One of them is what I think of, and I hope this will resonate with some of you here in Bellingham, of sort of the reverse talent dispersal or reverse migration. What I mean is, through modern history, in the age of capitalism and modernity, people have, of course, concentrated in great capital cities. They've gone from the hinterland of the British Isles to London. They've gone to Paris and to Rome. And through American history, people have concentrated in New York and DC and now in the big West Coast cities. And that flow will continue. But we were struck that at the same time, there's a significant and detectable reverse flow of people who feel either they have worked in San Francisco, Seattle, DC, New York, or they could work in those places, but they figure that the overall life calculation and life balance is simply more attractive in Greenville, or in Duluth, or in Sioux Falls, or in Bellingham, or in lots of other cities. And you could find around the country people who usually had some reason to think of that part of the country. They'd come to college at the University of Minnesota Duluth, or at Western, or at some other place, and they'd gotten to know that part of the country. Or they married somebody from there, or their parents were from there, or they had some relatives from there. But once they had that connection, they thought, there is the infrastructure here to do what I want in a business and civic and educational way. And often there are locally specific economic opportunities that, for example, in Fresno is having, along with Sioux Falls, they're becoming leaders in precision agriculture technology. because of their agricultural locations. Duluth, Minnesota has become a big aerospace tech place because of some aerospace legacy equipment there. There's a whole bunch of other illustrations, but we've met already in our 24 hours in Bellingham lots of people who have worked elsewhere and figured this is where they actually wanted to raise their families for a variety of reasons I don't need to belabor to you. And that's happening a lot of places. And I think the United States is unique in big countries in having 5 or 6 really major world dominant cities of the New York, San Francisco type scale, another 5 or 8 or 10 of the Dallas, Chicago, Atlanta, really major city scale, but then 3 or 4 layers below that of Columbus and Des Moines and just all these. There's a whole archipelago of people throughout the country who are doing interesting things. So that's one surprise to us. I'll just mention 2 others before giving you Deb again. A second is the difference between the national level rhetoric about immigration and ethnic change and the local level reality of that phenomenon. We all know the tone of national level rhetoric on immigration over the last couple of years. It was just dramatic to us that the only places you found that replicated locally is where there were no immigrants. Where this was sort of a distant threat, and that through most of the places that are going through ethnic change right now, the pattern is very much what it's been through American history, which is immigration has never been completely smooth. It's never been completely problem-free. The actual immigrants themselves never fully assimilate, et cetera, et cetera. That was true of the Germans and the Irish and the Italians and the Czechs and every other group you'd want to name. But their children and their grandchildren become, indistinguishable from everybody else except for a disproportionate entrepreneurial activity and et cetera. So we had, I'll just give you one brief illustration. We spent a lot of time in western Kansas, Dodge City, Garden City, the ironically named liberal, other places in western Kansas, which are now majority Latino populations because of the beef packing industry. And it was striking there that the business leadership of places like Dodge City is still mainly Anglo. They're the political leaders, the business leaders, but they are self-consciously voting themselves tax increases for schools for their mainly Latino school population. They are thinking this is the future. We describe in our book the drama of Ernesto de la Rosa, who's the finance manager of the city of Dodge City, a beloved figure in Dodge City, but is in the United States on a DACA waiver. And so Dodge City is dealing with the contradiction of how do they vote for an administration that wants to expel their city manager, their city finance manager, and finding ways to support him and to reconcile this. And I'll come to that later on. I guess, so it is impressive. If you hadn't heard any national rhetoric, you would think the process of integrating the world, which has been the United States' great strategic strength, in my view, historically, that process is still going on. And the only places where it seems like a real threat are where it's not happening. For example, Steve King, the congressman from Iowa, his district is 94% white. And so I think it's no coincidence that he is a leading build a wall proponent. I'll just mention a third thing before passing to Deb, which is the pattern of civic engagement that is at odds from national level disengagement. Without giving you the details, we have the sense there's a kind of a flourishing of experimental approaches to how you engage young people, how you engage older people, how you make people feel they have some stake in the future of their town. And I'll come to some details later on. But so those are just a few of the things that I didn't know 5 years ago. We think most people don't know if they haven't hit the road. And now Deb is going to give you another illustration of surprising things we learned about.
Thank you.
Which you, yes.
Yes, I'm holding this. Right. Right. What?
Precisely.
Pardon me?
No, proceed. Proceed, Governor.
Thank you, Jim. Yes. So we did, I loved we had a question when we went into the towns. What was the state or the nature of the public institutions in towns? The YMCAs, the public libraries, any other public place that you might go into. And this finally came as a real surprise to us of going into the public libraries. I was expecting the same public libraries that I grew up with, where there was a very stern librarian kind of shushing you and you hide in the back corner and read Nancy Drew and then you leave. But that, I'm sure most of you have been to your public libraries lately, but it was a real education to us and to me to go around from town to town seeing what they were about. I learned a lot from the Deschutes public libraries in Bend, Oregon. They had a new head librarian about a decade or 15 years ago who came to town and wanted to do an assessment of what people thought of the public libraries. So they did a big survey of the town and found that basically nobody knew anything or thought anything about the public libraries. It was just a nothing to them. So they made a plan to designate their librarians as community librarians with the task of going out into all of the organizations throughout town and embed themselves, become members in what was going on. So in a very Tocquevillian way, these librarians went out and joined about 60 different institutions around town to make alliances, from the Rotary to the foundations to the city clubs to the different community groups, and talk to them. First, they were surprised. Like, librarians walk in and they say, "What are you doing here? You know, what do you want to do with us?" So, it was part of the learning process of what each could offer the other, and they came away listening to the librarians talking about the needs of the community. And everybody goes into the library. It is the place to go to learn about what's going on in the town. You can ask a librarian and you'll find, as we did in Bend, that some of the major issues were, the biggest question was, how do I pay my rent? How do I keep up with my mortgage? Or, hey, can you just look at this little spot on my arm and help me, you know, I can't afford to go to the doctor, but let's look it up on the internet and see what I can find. Or, or fire prevention. The fires are, of course, a big issue in Bend, and the people are worried about what can we do to prevent it? What can we do? What are we supposed to do if we see one? So they made these alliances with all of these different groups and all of the different problems, kind of matched them up, and had programs at the library or addressed a lot of these issues where people could come and have civic meetings and learn about them. So after visiting, you know, many dozens of libraries around the country, it seemed to me that the libraries played important roles in 3 different areas: education, technology, and social and civic life. And just really briefly on that, of filling in the gaps in education in towns seemed like one of the critical things. When I'd ask library directors, what's the most important thing you're doing or you dream of doing here? It was always, it's all about the children. And in Columbus, Ohio, there was a new library being built in an area called Driving Park, where they used to have, actually they had these races between airplanes flying over and cars driving on the circle to see which could go faster. It was a great, this was a long time ago, obviously. But the area is still called Driving Park. It's a very distressed part of town. They built a brand new library. And I was asking the director about, he kept using the word reading readiness and just trying to get a grasp of how serious is this. And he says, here's reading readiness. When you've got a kindergartner walking into school and you hand him or her a book and he holds it upside down, there's no reading readiness there. So they start in by going out to, as he described to me, the bodegas, the public laundromats, the sidewalks where moms or dads are pushing strollers with new babies, and they kind of grab them and entice them into the library with this new children's section for storytelling, with free books to give away, with programs that is totally front-loaded on all of the skills for reading readiness, and attack the problem at that way. in a very serious way, the director of the library said, summers are the most important. We'll offer them breakfast. We'll offer them lunch. We'll offer them all-day programs. We own these children, is the way he described it to me, to try to get them ready for school. And they take it on through school with, after-school programs, homework help. A great, simple idea. They staffed the public school buses with big bins of books so that when kids get on the bus to take the ride home, they grab a book, they read it, they don't fight. They put the book back in the bin when they get off the bus, and everybody's happy, especially the bus drivers. Yeah. Anyway, so the education gap gets filled in by libraries in a huge way. Technology, this is again a story. I'm going to go back to Columbus, Ohio, because it's such a dramatic story. On the low end of technology, libraries are a tremendous resource for free Wi-Fi. 25% of people in the country do not have fast Wi-Fi at home, which I know from my Pew Research days. And the first thing you see in libraries are the big banks of computers where people go to use them. One of the biggest requests in public libraries of the librarians is, please can you help me with looking for a job? They're on a job search. So this was described to me. A young man comes into the library, sits down at the computer, he asks for help. The librarian comes through, they scroll through some possibilities for jobs. They find one, and she says, great, here's the application I've drawn up. You fill it in, and I'll come back in 10 minutes. We'll look it over and see how it turned out. That happened. She came back in 10 minutes. He had filled in the application on the screen with a marking pen because he simply didn't know what to do. That's the basic training of what is addressed with technology in public libraries. On the high end, you've got maker spaces where you have young entrepreneurs doing prototypes for their new companies on 3D printers. You've got homeschoolers, moms with teenagers trying to figure out what they can do with laser printers or computer-aided design and all this stuff that's going on at a very high level. And you've got young startup kids in the main hall starting their new companies because they can't afford to have a little office. And I asked the librarians, is there a resentment here that you are office space for all these kids? And they said, absolutely not. We just want them to remember when they have a successful company, this is where they started. And so just real briefly, you all know about the social and civic life that goes on in libraries. Everything from ESL classes to where you vote, to citizenship courses, and on the lighter kind of social side, in our DC Public Library on a Saturday afternoon at 4 p.m., you will see 70 people doing the tango. On Tuesday at 11 o'clock, I know because I go there are yoga classes. And inside these public institutions, it's not just the ladies doing yoga. You are sharing the same space with the homeless people who are there at 10 to 9 every morning waiting for the doors to open. And it's this physical sharing of the same space that you're not going to get in a lot of places in your life when you drive by, that you get a different kind of sense of empathy and understanding of what's going on in the YMCA when you're swimming, or in the locker rooms, or in the public libraries where you're sharing spaces like that. So we have, as you can tell, become real fans and cheerleaders for the public libraries.
So for reasons of time, I'm going to skip this next section I was going to do, and if you can just talk briefly about the public arts in San Bernardino, then I'll do just the conclusion. Okay. Yeah.
So, yes. Okay.
Your third segment. Yeah.
Yes. And I get too excited and go on too long, but we have learned about the important role of public arts in communities, and in San Bernardino is one great example of public art in a civic role. There's San Bernardino in California is it's a town that went bankrupt. It's a town that has very difficult problems. And can you please just explain the Constitution?
So there's a uniquely flawed civic charter in San Bernardino. Who's been to San Bernardino? It's a really hard luck town. 2 generations ago, the public service unions there put through a provision that the pay for police and fire staffers in San Bernardino would be pegged to 3 similar cities in California: Pasadena, Oceanside, and one more like that, Los Altos or something. So you had the poorest city in California paying the highest salaries for their public workers, which was a big problem.
So there's a group, as the city was deteriorating, we met a group of millennials who were basically artists in San Bernardino who were tired of people saying how bad their town was, how negative it was. They said, this is our town and we're proud of it. So they formed a group called San Bernardino Generation Now. They're young, they're in their 30, give or take. And the purpose, the ultimate purpose of this group was to educate young kids and their parents on the importance of voting. So they started out doing what they do best. They in a very kind of Pied Piper way, they went around cleaning up parks. They got kind of a contingent following them. They painted over bad murals with good murals. They started festivals on Saturdays in the public parks with music and face painting and cotton candy. And they took videos. At these great enticements, they were educating about the civic issues of what was going on in town and the importance to vote. So they made videos of this, and then they got their way into the public school systems and took them into the government and history classes in those public schools to help educate those kids on the importance of voting, and then taking them home with their message to their parents on voting. And you can tell what happened.
And they did. So.
And they did. And so it was either the last, and they voted. Yeah. And they voted a new constitution. And they're, on their way towards some adjustments that will make that town, we all hope, survive.
Yeah. So they're coming out of bankruptcy with a new charter. They have, for the past 80 years, this district, congressional district, which is heavy majority Latino, had been represented by Anglo-Republicans, but they just, 2 years ago had their first Democratic Latino representative there, and it's engagement there has made a difference. So I'm going to just, for a minute or two, suggest what all this means beyond a collection of stories that have fascinated us. The main point we got religion on is again this contrast between the national panorama of nothing is possible, nobody can agree, nothing can get done, your success is somebody else's failure, and all the other traits we know of national politics now, versus the sense at the local level of experimentation, renewal, reinvention, re-engagement, that did not mean that any of the problems that we hear about don't exist. I mean, every problem you know about in the United States is evident in the United States, from economic dislocation to racial violence, racial public safety violence and other challenges of America's racial history, to opioids, which are a disaster, especially in, well, we were in Charleston, West Virginia 2 weeks ago. They said actually meth is taking over for opioids again in West Virginia, which was depressing news. To all the other problems you know about in the United States, we saw evidence of, but we also saw this sense of engagement and possibility and trying and thinking as if the civic narrative was moving in a positive rather than a negative direction. And as we've tried to reconcile that contradiction, what it is that makes such a dark period nationally, regardless of your national political view, and most people feeling such promise despite challenges locally, we have a potential explanation, but then a sort of sense of where in history's arc we might all be, and how to think about the things you're doing in Bellingham and other people are doing in Allentown or are doing in Columbus, Mississippi, or St. Mary's, Georgia, or wherever else. The diagnosis is that something has happened with national politics to make it an abstract, quasi-religious, polarized, sort of no compromise, attitude that is just separated from people's daily realities. We noticed this because, as I mentioned, we would never ask people their national political views when we went someplace, because as soon as you did that, the rest of the conversation was 100% predictable. You know, you would not learn anything. It would just be like listening to talk radio or one of the cable networks. But if you asked them about what new industries were coming to the town, what the healthcare situation was, how they were dealing with law enforcement, how they were dealing with incarceration, people had really interesting and three-dimensional views, and you could really move forward. And it actually struck us after we were back-to-back in the cities of Burlington, Vermont, very progressive. The two parties there, no joke, are the Democratic Party and the Socialist Party. Those are the two parties in Burlington. And Greenville, South Carolina, very conservative, Bob Jones University, Trey Gowdy, Jim DeMint, that if you didn't know they were opposite cities, you would think they were the same city. The mayor works with the businesses, works with the public schools, works with the NGOs, works with all the immigrant groups, and they worked very similarly. And so something about our predicament right now has made national politics bad in all the ways we know, but not representative of the actual texture of American public life at the local level. And so when you hear people say the nation's divided like never before, that is true for the 1% of life that consists of national elections. That's a very significant 1%. But there's a lot of life that is not that 1%. And so we're trying to emphasize the existence of this difference. That city by city, it's not like watching the US Congress, or it's not like watching cable news. So if you accept, let's assume for the moment you accept that hypothesis. What then is the case? I'm going to give you the two paths through the woods analogy here to end up. There's a brighter path and there's a more discouraging path. And we can see, obviously we hope for the brighter one, but analytically this is where we think we are. The brighter path is to imagine that we are 120 years moved backwards in time. That the problems of our era are very, very similar to those of the first Gilded Age. Economic extremes, ethnic change, political corruption, political cynicism, environmental despoliation, all kinds of things that happen now happened then. Obviously, there's never exact repetition, but there's a lot of similarities. And it also was the case, globalization was a huge shock then, political change was a huge shock, new technologies made new fortunes and eliminated old jobs. If you look back on that age, you also see that people around 1900, there was a very important labor union movement around the country. There was a women's suffrage movement around the country. There were African American rights movements around the country. There was an environmental movement beginning. There were 20 other movements that didn't realize they were connected. Muckraking journalism, civic reform, Jane Addams, civil service reform. And looking backwards, we recognize that all these dispersed movements eventually had some sense that they were going in the same direction. Both individual movements like the labor movement, connected from the Midwest to the mountain states to the industrial East Coast. The women's movement spread across the country, and these different reform movements got a collective momentum to them to try out different sorts of approaches. This is what Louis Brandeis, of course, meant by the laboratories of democracy when he had his famous ruling in the 1930s, looking backwards and all this. So there was all of the ferment initially uncoordinated and dispersed, but after a while having a sense of its coherence and momentum that made for the progressive era and sort of the whole realm of reforms in a whole variety of fields that followed the first Gilded Age. So the brighter path ahead would be to think that that's what's happening now. That people in 1,000 places, without knowing they're doing the same thing, are experimenting, trying out ideas, forming new networks, and we hope without world wars, without Great Depression, we'd be able to recreate the good parts of the first half of the 20th century. And this is something that Deb and I intend to spend the next stage of our life on, actually trying to tell more of these stories, connect people, increase the leverage of people who are doing things across the country and don't know they're all part of what could become a movement. The darker path through the woods is one that my friend Cullen Murphy, who's a longtime editor for The Atlantic, describes as the new dark ages, but in a good way. and what he means is, yeah, the Roman Empire collapsed, and maybe the American system is going to collapse, but there were lots of little principalities and duchies and fiefdoms in Europe where they kept the old traditions alive. They had nice artistic traditions throughout Europe, and so you could have the flourishing of local life in the face of the decline of the Roman Empire. Clearly, between these two paths, I hope that the new progressive era, as opposed to the new dark ages, is the one we're on. But either way, it means that the task at hand is to work locally, because that is where the purchase is, that's where the traction is, that's where people can deal with things. So our gospel here is to say, everything you're doing in Bellingham, to work on education, to work on the downtown, to work on all the other challenges and opportunities you have, that's the important thing to do here, and to ally with your contemporaries in Marshall, Texas, and in Duluth, Minnesota, and in Allentown, PA, and in 100 other places you might not know about, and we're going to try to put you all together. So that is our big finish, and I give you Deb. Yes. So that's it. Thank you.
Well, are you hopeful? Good. So we put together a few questions from our committee, and then we'll turn it over to everybody else. So I wanted to ask you, in both those scenarios, how this would work out, because you visited a lot of communities that were well aware of the challenges and possible benefits to them of climate change. I was thinking mostly of Eastport, Maine on the Bay of Fundy. You thought, now we're going to be the northernmost port because everything's going to melt. So did you find much conversation about that in other towns, or an openness to the concept either economically or environmentally?
Yes, I think that every, let's see, which end of this? Okay, so since mayors and local civic groups have to deal with reality rather than sort of tribal theoretical wars, every place recognizes that their circumstances are changing, that the rainfall is getting more or less, temperature is changing, usually up. Water levels are changing. And the allusion to Eastport is, Eastport, Maine is going, they have a high-low mix when it comes to dealing with the environment. The sort of high principled mix is they're on the Bay of Fundy, huge tidal power. They have tidal generators out there to create electricity. Also, when the Canadian Arctic melts, as Jane said, they'll be the closest East Coast port to China. So they're building a great port for China shipments from Eastport. So either way, they are planning. But yes, I think that mayors and local people recognize that part of the mix of assets their community has, assets and challenges, includes change in their agriculture, change in just everything. So and conservation efforts. You noted after the United States pulled out of the Paris Accord a year and a half ago, mayors representing something like 70% of the U.S. population said their cities were still going to stay with it. So, and mayors representing most of state, or governors representing most states said the same thing.
Okay. So you mentioned that when you arrived at a new town, the newspaper office was usually one of the first places that you stopped to get some feeling for who you wanted to talk to. And yet the decline of the local media and its watchdog role seems to have reached a nadir. Can you comment on this and its effect on democracy?
I'm going to make Jim do that too, because he's the journalist in the family.
I'm one of the two journalists in the family. I'm a longer tenured journalist than Deb. Local journalism is of crucial importance for local civic engagement, because it's how people know about the schools and the city government and everything else that is much of the reality of their lives. We found some places where the local publications had become unusual success stories. The easiest illustration is in a newspaper called 7 Days in Burlington, Vermont. It's a one-time alt weekly that's become now a huge it's a main statewide newspaper in Vermont, and does all kinds of, it was early on the opioid story, and there are some other isolated successes we found, but the pressure on journalism in general is especially intense on local publications. And so I think that is just a reality whose direness needs to be recognized, and therefore I think it's important that within the journalism business and also the NGO world, there's a huge amount of experimentation on what can be done about this, recognizing that it's a very important area to shore up, and also the cost of shoring it up is not that great by philanthropic standards or NGO standards or university standards. And what's happening now, I think, is just, I can think personally of 50 different experiments that are underway of how you correct this gap. For example, when we were in West Virginia, the newspaper there, the Charleston Gazette, which was just sold, they have new locally based owners, and part of their reporting staff now is something called Report for America. This is sort of a Teach for America counterpart of young journalists who are working in underserved areas. There's equivalent, Deb's parents worked overseas for something called the International Executive Service Corps, retired business people who went overseas, something like that for senior journalists who could work with small publications as volunteers to pass on the trade, having journalism schools become the anchors for publications. There's lots of different models, but it's a crucial thing to address.
Thank you. When you talk about connecting our towns, our people, how do you envision that happening?
Over to you.
Okay, thanks.
You have the talking stick.
Right. This is where we'd really like help from the audience on how to do this. There are a number of ideas that we've heard about from other people, and one is to make your efforts, to expand them a little bit so that they're not exactly local but regional, because there's more ways to scale up in that sense. In Erie, Pennsylvania, which has a lot of troubles with their school system, and they have 10% of their population is actually refugees, so they've got particular issues in trying to make sure that there is an employment base for those people. They talk frequently about pushing their borders out to discuss these issues and find commonalities with, a couple 100-mile radius where they can work together. I think convening meetings of like-minded groups, say librarians, but not, librarians have plenty of meetings now, but a lot of them said to me that it's difficult to go to these national meetings because they just don't have the funds behind it for the librarians to travel that far. So having regional meetings where you'd maybe find more commonalities is important, and then applying some sense. We met this wonderful guy named Eric Liu from Seattle, who has a group called Citizens University, and they go from town to town to town, helping people kind of understand how to work together around issues and across differences. And the particular, I think, key of what they do in these meetings is to charge everyone with a task. If you come in with a problem you want to discuss and you take it to the group individually, if they have ideas, make promises to that person to say, yes, this is about voting. Here's what we tried in Duluth. I promise that I will connect you to the people who did this in Duluth and talk to them about how they solved their problems and to bring it back to your group. So that there's an actual takeaway, an action-taking item, rather than just getting together in a meeting and talking about it and going out the door and never hearing of it again. There is a follow-through. Do you have more things?
We would like to be in touch with you all. We can give you cards, and we have contact info for our book, because this is what we want actually to do next, is to find ways to to try to follow the model of 120 years ago and put together now disparate reform efforts, disparate by topic, disparate by region, disparate by identity, into for some larger whole.
And we'll be anxious to follow along with you. So we're going to turn it over to the audience for questions now.
Could you talk a little bit about what you see happening in higher education? I think what you were talking about in elementary school education is inspirational. Higher education is getting out of reach and out of control, cost-wise, and so what do you see happening there?
So I'll first confess my ignorance or my limited knowledge on one front, and then an area where I have changed my mind. Limited knowledge is we all recognize that the cost pressures of four-year universities are becoming really serious. I don't know enough to have a really good answer to that. I think that there should be some way creatively to connect service opportunities for students to reducing burdens of debt or whatever, but I do not know enough to really address that. What we were impressed by, and I feel as if I know something more about, is the community college revolution and boom, which we ended up thinking is really important, and it's sort of an answer to this. I'd always taken for granted that the U.S. research universities were kind of the strategic high ground for the U.S., and of course they are. But I now think that community colleges are the most important institutions right now for, at a reasonable cost, comparatively, connecting students looking for opportunity with the opportunities that actually exist. And there are a lot of new opportunities that I could shorthand this way. People whose parents used to work in factories, and those factories are gone. There are now a growing number of skilled tech jobs in the welding category and the robotics repair category and the skilled agriculture and skilled healthcare category, where they need more people to do those, and they pay reasonable wages. That's it's the new factory jobs of this era, and community colleges we saw as making that connection. So I agree with you that the financing of four-year education is really serious, and I don't know enough to say, but community colleges are at least pushing in the right direction.
This is something that just doesn't scale, but it's an example of experimentation that in a tiny community there would be some founding father philanthropist who was in a position to say, if you spend 12 years in public schools in this town, I will pay for your college education. That kind of thing is happening.
Yeah, there's about 100 cities that have that, the Promise Agreement.
Yeah, and NYU has just made some kind of announcement that they will have free tuition there. So I don't know how that's going to work out, but we certainly have seen a mass movement of young people for themselves, one by one, figuring out that I'll go to community college for a couple of years, get myself halfway through school and then beyond to the rest of it.
One of my concerns is science. How did you see science in the country as you were going around? Because it seems like it's under pressure.
Again, there's the national policy level where there are problems I don't need to belabor to anyone. I think that most communities and many schools recognize that science is the basis of business and development. So we didn't find any denialism or know-nothingism about science at the working level in American life now. Just to give you one illustration, I spent a day in Dodge City with a company named Servitech, which is a place that is advancing precision agriculture in the plains, of being able to put one drop of irrigation on the one seed that's there and one drop of pesticide, and just radically and monitor sort of meter by meter the soil moisture levels. So you can, that kind of scientific use of big data and sensors and genomics and everything else, we saw no primitivism in sort of real American life, only at this national level discourse.
What town is on the book jacket?
Yes, any guesses?
And what is your guess?
Well, it looks like Bellingham, but it's...
Well, so it is Bellingham.
Yeah.
It's
So we have Lake Champlain in the foreground.
Yes.
Here.
It is
Yes.
Bellingham East, also known as Burlington, Vermont. But Burlington, Vermont.
But there's a paperback coming out, so
Yeah.
if you got a great photo, right?
How do you see the state level, whether it be government or otherwise, fitting into your analysis?
Let's see, where geographic? So, we saw a wide variety of state governments, more of them on the practical side than the impractical. But at some state governments we found having become nationalized in their bitter politics. Clearest example would be Kansas, of course. And interestingly, the same parts of western Kansas that are very, very right-wing in their national voting are very, quote, practical-minded in their local politics. For all the cities in western Kansas, when the state government cut their school funding, they voted new bond issues for their school population. Something similar in Michigan, too. So most state governments we saw, like the state government of Mississippi had until fairly recently been advanced in its school funding. That is being somewhat backsliding at the moment, but state governments generally were more like the cities than they were like the national politics.
Did you find anything you said something about opioids, which I can't pronounce, I'm an idiot, in West Virginia. Did you find anything to say that there are more opportunities for ex-coal workers in those areas? And that, because it said to me that maybe something's coming out of them not having jobs.
Yeah. There are 20 different hypotheses about why there's the opioid epidemic, probably all of them partly true. I think we are more and more in the big pharma explanation for opioids, as opposed to purely an unemployment situation. On the coal mines, we were in Charleston, West Virginia recently, as I said. Who would have a guess for when peak employment in the coal mining industry in the U.S. was? Was it just before Obama was elected, and so Obama drove it down, et cetera? It was 1918. I mean, it's been a 100-year decline in coal mining employment. Coal production has continued to rise, or stay steady to rise, but because of mechanization, the western coal fields. But just like everything else, the actual employment has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And so there is like most other American economic history, in my view, is the story of unending economic disruption. After the Civil War, most Americans were farmers, and now 1% of Americans are farmers. And so you have, that whole part of most Americans had disruption within 4 or 5 generations. My parents, their families both had big, depression-oriented economic disruptions. This is the case. The surprise or the anomaly in West Virginia right now is the people who have decided not to move away, because the main American pattern has been people moving away when the jobs have disappeared. And for understandable reasons, there are families there that feel that this is their homeland, they don't want to move. So in West Virginia, there are some new opportunities. There is a new clean energy movement going on there. There's small manufacturing. West Virginia has an idea that it should become like either Colorado or Vermont in terms of being a resort area, in that it is really beautiful and it's really low cost. And so they're thinking, if Vermont can do this, why not West Virginia? And so lots of things are happening, but there's this crisis of people whose jobs have gone away, and the industry is not going to come back. The real problem in central West Virginia is not just the coal industry going down, but the chemicals industry going away. The whole Charleston and Huntington area, it was more chemicals dependent than coal over the last generation. And after the Bhopal disaster in India a generation ago, that really put Union Carbide in an entirely different trajectory. And that is, more people were put out of work by that than by coal in the last generation in West Virginia. So it's a dispersed, different range of industries going up now, but there's no big new industry other than the one they're hoping for, which is tourism, just saying we are a beautiful place.
We've got 2 major talent pools in our area here. One is an influx of very well-educated, highly experienced, talented people who've chosen to retire here, and we also have young people coming in every year for higher education. Can you give us examples of a couple of places that have been especially effective at bringing these two pieces of talent together to have effective outcomes?
So my two illustrations would be a place I'm sure many of you have been, Bend in Central Oregon. You know, Bend, as people don't recognize now, 30 years ago had the highest unemployment rate in the country, you know, with the collapse of the timber industry there, which also is not coming back in the same way. And they very consciously said, we have the advantage of being a place where people want to live. And so they have a big draw for retirees. They didn't have much of a student draw because they don't have a university. They have a very ambitious community college, Central Oregon Community College. So they've tried, but they have very, very deliberately made themselves an attractive place. The other, surprisingly, is Duluth, Minnesota. I don't know if anybody's been to Duluth. They have, it's become a very hip place for outdoors activities. Outside Magazine said this is best city recently. That was an online poll where all Duluthers had to vote, but still. You know, they beat Asheville and Boulder. And so it's, young people are drawn there by University of Minnesota, Duluth, and a couple other colleges. Retirees like being there. So I would look at the examples of Duluth and Central Oregon in attracting people want to live there and young people want to come there. And yes, and Deb has one more or more.
I'm going to pile on to Duluth, which there's a further thing that's happening with these two groups in Duluth, that there are a lot of young, ambitious, post-college age kids who are wanting to start new companies, and there's a group of retired, powerful founding fathers who are in a position as bankers or ex-bankers, as politicians in the town to say, we obviously need each other. We will help you get going. We trust you. We will kind of extend our credit to you if you do these certain things. If you build your company here and stay in the town and help, and then they do, and then they help work on the school system. So it's this whole melting pot of new and old, bringing whatever their assets, energy or finance, into the town to make it work together.
And Greenville, South Carolina, too. Without
That's
the details,
right.
Greenville
Yeah,
has done
there are
this
a
very
number
well.
of towns
Yeah.
like that, actually.
My question is about the integrity of voting systems in the community.
Yeah.
I'm proud that I was part of a group 15 years ago that started working jointly with the election system and have brought forward what I believe is an excellent system of maintaining the activity and the integrity and the belief and the trust in the election system. Let me first ask the audience, please give an applaud if you know our system and like it. Yeah. So how can we spread that nationally?
I've reported on the tech industry for a long time. I once worked in the tech industry for a while. Everybody I know in the tech industry thinks that electronic voting systems are a disaster, and you need to have traceable paper trails for, yes. So I think that the only practical advice I would have is rolling out the titans of the tech industry say, look, we're in favor of technology for everything, but not this. You're just asking for trouble if you don't have accountable paper systems. So we'll try to learn more about the systems and spread the word. And congratulations.
You noted the distinction between the polarization and dysfunction on a national level with what you saw locally. Do you see or fear the sort of the drumbeat of national media pushing that dysfunction down on us? The more we see it, are we more likely to engage in it here?
That's a very interesting question, too. And I think we've seen that in some states. You know, as some state politics has become, does candidate X for a state legislature, he or she either lines up with the national party or against the national party, and then you have that kind of seeping of the poison. I don't know of many cities yet where that has happened, but certainly that is something to robustly guard against. So it is happening in some states. I'm hoping that the next few waves of state elections will have enough engagement to try to redress that balance. But it is, yes, that is one more thing to worry about.
In all of your travels, did you get the impression, can you hear me? Did you get the impression that people are looking to growth management? Are they working together? Are they aware of this?
So on growth management issues, yes, depending on the situation a certain city is in. For example, in Charleston, West Virginia, their population is half what it was 50 years ago. So their growth strategy now is attracting people there and finding a way to do it. Then at the other extreme, you have Seattle or San Francisco, where wealth is out of control. But I think that a difference in general with city governments compared to national government is they can realistically think 10 and 20 and 50 years ahead. So they can say, if we try to protect these green areas, if we try to have this kind of affordable housing and this kind of downtown development attracting people, they have some hope of actually aligning things in that direction, which at the national level, it's almost impossible to do. So yes, I think at different stages of civic life, growth management means different things, but yes, I think that kind of consciousness is on the mind of lots of places that we saw.
Could you want to handicap what our upcoming election is going to result in?
So I think the question was, do we want to handicap? And I think I can say no. The two-sentence answer is, God knows, and certainly all the omens are that there would be a change in party control of the House. There are almost 50 incumbent Republicans who aren't running, which hasn't happened in a century. There's a whole crop of new Democratic candidates. The special elections have all gone in one direction, or the turnout has been skewed in one direction. So that's what the omen would seem to be, but I guess that's why they actually have the elections, to see what happens. So we'll watch with interest.
What is your opinion about how social media affects the coming together or being in our disparate little camps life of a community?
So social media, I remember 15 years ago when there was this sort of Pandora, or not Pandora, of just sort of Pollyanna view that being connected would make everything better. And obviously we recognize the ways in which it's more complicated than that. I think that it's, I think that's not one of my devices going off, because the alarm, this would be, it's, in the Gilded Age theme, there was a big concern in the early 1900s about what radio was going to mean, even before television. No, seriously, and Walter Lippmann had this famous book, Public Opinion, of what it was going to mean that people could hear in real time about things they couldn't see for themselves, and how that would make it difficult to have serious deliberation. So we're dealing with the latest important manifestation of a long-standing human condition. And I think that there will be, current companies, especially Facebook, have been just reckless about this. I think Facebook is an outlier in its recklessness. And I think because they've been reckless, there will be a coming to terms, or there will be private or public efforts to control this force and then steer it in more constructive and less destructive ways. But it's been, it's a long-standing issue, and it can be a serious problem now. And I think that at least, well, it's another big problem to deal with.
But,
yes.
I think on a local level, we've seen a lot of indications where social media fills in the gaps and picks up the baton. Yeah. Like when everybody's hungry for local news, and I've seen newsletters from all kinds of different organizations that get the message out, whether it's for a parade or a meeting that's going on, where it's a lot more effective than just having something pinned to a bulletin board. Or for safety issues, everybody's got this next door information sharing apps, which are really useful and much more effective than just blowing a horn or standing on a podium at the street corner. So I think it's you know, certainly there are places locally where it's really working well.
How are the standout towns dealing with homelessness?
So the homelessness front, this is one more, along with opioids, this is just a universal problem in big city America right now, and small city too, with roots stemming back a generation or two to changes in mental health law and institutionalization, as you know, with housing prices in bigger cities, with current drug scourges, with all sorts of sources. And since there's no one source, there is no one answer to it. The most interesting efforts we've seen are actually in Los Angeles, where it's a serious problem in Los Angeles, and where Eric Garcetti's administration is using a lot of advanced data tools to try to have some prediction of where the next intense areas of homelessness crisis are going to be as rent trends change and as drug arrest pattern changes. And they have sort of this predictive dashboard of where they need to be most on guard for this. And so the solutions, again, no one cause, no one solution, but I think there are experiments every place to see what combination of approaches can at least reverse the pattern as opposed to solving the problem, because it is one more serious problem of big cities around the world and cities of all size within the United States.
Another thing we've seen in smaller cities is collaboration among civic groups looking at this problem. In Jim's hometown of Redlands, California, which is, I would say a prosperous town, there's a lot of homelessness, not so much individuals on street corners as children and families without homes. And there you've got the cooperation of the school system identifying these kids, the local neighborhood groups and realtors being able to designate short-term housing solutions, the groups that help take care of kids who are on their own after school and feed them for dinners and offer them leftover clothing and things like that, and a place to do their homework. And the police department, who will at night find families living under the freeway in a car and identify them and kind of get them into this group care system. It works really well in that town because there are a dozen agencies that are all doing a piece of that entire picture of action. And so, that's another way out that the big cities probably don't do as well.
So I want to end with a little happier note. And Deb, in the book, you talk about all the different towns you went and how different it was in each town, that each town had a question they asked their newcomers. And could you tell us what some of those questions were?
Yeah, this is great. We first learned this in Greenville, South Carolina, where you get a group, you may not all know each other. After hello, how do you do, it's where do you go to church? And that, of course, becomes the currency for finding out a lot about who people are, especially in Greenville, where churches are very political. In anybody here from St. Louis? Okay, I'm sticking my neck out. What's your second question in St. Louis? Okay, anybody from Louisville? It's where'd you go to high school? Everyone I've met from St. Louis, yes, okay, at least we get a nod there. It's always where'd you go to high school? In my hometown, among the older people in Chicago, it's not just where do you go to church, but what parish do you live in? And they say, even if you're not Catholic, you know exactly what parish you live in. In Wyoming, did you get your elk yet? Seriously, that's the question. Of course, in New York and Washington, D.C., it's where do you work or where do you live? They always want to talk about real estate. In Los Angeles, how'd you get here? Well, I took the 10 to the 405, kind of on from there. In New Orleans, two versions of this question. Who's your mama? meaning everybody's kind of related, and you know who your daddy is from your last name, but who's your mama? Or how's your mama and them, which is kind of an introduction to the same thing. In Alaska, in Seattle, Atlanta, places where people are from elsewhere, it's where are you from, because you're not going to be from there. In Alaska, you never say where you're from, I heard, because you're sloughing off that sketchy past and nobody wants to bring it up. So the question back to you all is, what do you say here in Bellingham? What's your question? How long have you lived here? How long have you been here? Okay. Yeah, and is there, and I mean, I see.
Yeah.
Pardon? How do you like it here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I did a very unscientific poll among people, and they said the question is, what are you reading? Which makes us sound terribly literate, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So how about a very big thank you to two wonderful guests.
Okay.